So let's think about a angle theta that is in the first quadrant. The opposite side here is going to be positive because we are going up on the y-axis. And the adjacent side will also be positive because we are going over on the positive x-axis. And remember, the hypotenuse is always positive when we draw a reference triangle. So we can see so will be positive over positive, cosine ka will be positive over positive, and tangent toa will also be positive over positive. So all of the trig functions in the first quadrant will be positive. There will be no negative ones. But if we look at the second quadrant and we look at an angle that has been drawn in the second quadrant, remember we decide all of its sine, cosine, tangent from the reference angle, which is this little guy here. The actual angle is this guy. That's our actual angle. But we use the reference angle to determine sine, cosine, and tangent. And on this side, we can see that the opposite is going up, which is a positive, but the adjacent, we are going to the left. That is on the negative x-axis. So the adjacent will be negative. And then because of Pythagorean theorem and a few other things, we always consider the hypotenuse to be positive. So over here, we can see that sine will be positive, but that cosine and tangent are going to be negatives because ka adjacent will be a negative over a positive and toa will be a positive over a negative. When we look at the third quadrant, we can see that both the adjacent and the opposite are going to be negative. That means that when we do tangent toa, a negative divided by a negative is going to be positive, but cosine and sine are going to be negatives. And finally, if we look in the fourth quadrant, we can see that the opposite is going down, so that will be a negative. The adjacent is going to the right on the positive x-axis, so that will be a positive. And hypotenuse is always positive. So if we look at this reference angle, so opposite over hypotenuse is going to be negative. Tangent is going to be negative, but cosine, ka, adjacent over hypotenuse is going to be positive, while sine and tangent are negative. So what we can see from this is if we look at our big three, sine, cosine, and tangent, we see all of them are positive in the first quadrant, sine is positive in the second, tangent is positive in the third, and cosine is positive in the fourth. And if we know this, then that can help us sort of make predictions about things. For instance, if I tell you that I have an angle whose sine is positive but whose cosine is negative, well, then we know that second quadrant is the only place that that can happen. So it's important for us to be able to quickly determine what is positive and what is negative in each of these quadrants. That is why we have the mnemonic, all students take calculus. So if we use this mnemonic and we start in the first quadrant, all students take calculus. What you can see is that this is telling us what is positive in those quadrants. And then we just have to remember that the other two major trig functions are negative. This is something that we will be using quite a bit as we continue forward in trigonometry.